Hello everyone, welcome back to the Daily Knitter podcast. My name is Tiffany. Today's episode might be a little shorter. I have 2 finished objects, 2 whips, and I'm going to talk about some future plans as well. So let's just get started. If you follow me on Instagram, my Instagram is the Daily Knitter 94. I always have it linked down below. I update my whips and finished objects much quicker on Instagram because I film these podcasts maybe once every 2 weeks so that I have enough, things to show you all. But if you're interested on a more day-by-day progress update, I am on Instagram there, and I pretty much, I'm on Instagram every day. So that's where I interact the most with people. So if you follow me on Instagram, you would have already seen my post on my finished Lulu slipover in the junior size. And I'm going to talk all about the pattern, some of the new things that I learned with knitting this pattern, my yarn choice, and how that probably affected the way this piece eventually turned out, and just, things that I noticed and how I felt about knitting this piece. So this is a pattern by Petite Knit, and she has the Lulu slipover in a women's size range as well as the junior size range. And the reason why I purchased the junior size is because I'm going to knit 2 of these for my nieces for Christmas. If you saw my last podcast episode, I showed the yarn that I purchased for them individually that they got to pick out themselves. It was really cute. And that's the yarn that I'm going to use for their slipovers. So I obviously purchased the junior size because they're both young, but because I wanted to practice some elements of the pattern that I was not super familiar with, I didn't want to go ahead and just purchase the women's size again, because typically I can actually fit into a girl's size 12 to 14, 14 to 16, which I know sounds crazy, but I feel like a lot of times junior girl sizes run pretty big, and I am 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, so I'm pretty petite. So even in my everyday life, I purchase girls size clothing, not all the time because the fashion obviously is a little younger, but I have before and I'm very comfortable wearing that size. So I figured I could just knit something in the junior size and it would be fine. That being said, this pattern calls for 20 centimeters of positive ease, which in my opinion is very big. I'm going to stick with that anyways and knit the correct size for my nieces and not do any modifications, because even if it ends up being a little bit bigger, that's okay because they're still growing. So I'm not too worried about knitting something too big for them. However, for myself, when I was looking at it, I kind of wanted this vest to fit more like a classic sweater vest rather than like it's intended. And I will have put photos of what the pattern looks like, and you can see it's meant to really be kind of like a loose slip over that you can wear over a t-shirt or even over another sweater. It's really meant to be a kind of loose flowing piece, if that makes sense. But in my head, for myself, I didn't necessarily want a piece like that. I just wanted something to be a little tighter fitting. So I did the calculation and I essentially knitted this in the size that is technically for 7 to 8 year olds, which is insane. I know that sounds insane, but the bust circumference after blocking of the garment would have been 95 centimeters, and I have a bust of about 83 centimeters. So to me, that was still gonna be a lot of positive ease at the end of the piece, even though technically it's meant for like a 7 to 8 year old. So that was how I kind of decided and picked on the size that I went with, which, like I said, was the 7th size. She doesn't go by extra small to like 3XL or anything. It just all goes by years. So that's why it's kind of confusing in the junior, but that is the size I went with. Now, that being said, this is smaller even than that. And I think the reasoning is because I used a 100% acrylic yarn that after blocking does grow a little bit, but not a lot. And I surmise that with the bust circumference of the finished piece that Petite Knit has, it's based on the yarn that she knit with the gauge. And she usually knits with like 100% merino wool, which this one I think is the Peer Gynt by Sandisgarn was the recommended. I'm looking at it on the side, that's why. And so merino wool really stretches out a lot after blocking. So this did end up being a wee tight for me. I probably could have sized up 1 to 2 sizes, and that probably would have been exactly the fit I was looking for. But you can see in the photos of me wearing it, this still ends up fitting fine, and this by no means has negative ease on me. I would just say it's maybe like 1 to 2 centimeters of positive ease. So a little bit, again, tighter than I was thinking, but I actually think it ended up turning out fine because I'm just gonna plan on wearing this as a standalone tank top rather than something that goes over a shirt. But I did try it over one of my long sleeve shirts that's similar to this, a collared shirt, and it technically does fit over it. It is snug, and I do think because I knitted it so cropped, it looks weird going over a shirt because it's so short. So either way, I am still happy with how it ended up coming out because of the cute kind of like cropped sweater vest look. So I'm not sad about it, but there are some things that I did not anticipate, probably because of the yarn choice. But before we talk about yarn, I'm gonna go through and talk through the pattern and things I liked and things I didn't like, as well as new things that I learned. Slipover is knit completely top down flat. Now, I knew that going in because I obviously purchased the pattern and read the description on the website, and I don't love knitting things flat. I think like most knitters, I prefer to knit in the round because you can just knit, and you don't have to purl at all. But I liked this pattern enough, and I figured I was knitting a smaller piece for both of my nieces, so it would go by pretty quickly. So even though I had to knit it completely flat, it wouldn't really bother me that much. And I will say it was nice to knit with. I think partially because of the yarn. Because it was a thicker yarn, I didn't mind the purling as much, and it created this beautiful kind of dense fabric. So that part I didn't mind as much, but you know, that is a warning if you really don't like knitting flat. This entire piece is knit flat, and you can kind of see when I unbutton it, that's, you know, it essentially is like one giant flat piece that you secure together with button plackets. It's pretty much knit with, you know, standard knitting techniques like increases, and I don't actually believe there were any German short rows that were needed. Let me just do a quick look at it right now. Yeah, I don't think I had to do any German short rows, so if you're not used to that or haven't done that before, you won't need to do that with this piece. Once you knit the body, basically from, you know, top to bottom, you then have to add on the armhole ribbing. I'm sorry, this is in black, so it's gonna be a little hard to tell, but you can see. So then I had to add this armhole ribbing, which you add onto the entire length one at a time. So you kind of do one hole and then the other hole. And that part was fine, but I will say because you have to pick up so many stitches, it's a lot. And also, again, because of the yarn choice, this was a black yarn, so it was really hard for me to see where to correctly pick up stitches. It was a little difficult. I really had to be under like bright sunlight to see where to pick up. So I don't anticipate that being a real problem because the other two yarns that I'm using are lighter colors. So I think that was just more so because of the yarn choice, but you do have to pick up over 120 stitches at one point. So just kind of getting used to that and practicing that technique. I actually found this YouTube video of this woman who uses a crochet hook to pick up the stitches, which I use that method, and it was much quicker than trying to do it with my needle. So if you are interested, that's like a technique that you can use, is using a crochet hook to go in and pick it up and then put it on your needle. I thought that was really helpful, and I ended up doing that for both sides of picking up for the armholes. And then beyond that, the only technique that I had never done before was the button plackets. So knitting this kind of extra flat piece that you can see here. And I will say, again, because of the yarn, because of how thick it was really hard for me to tell, honestly, where the actual end was, because you have to pick up all the way to the end. So you can tell on this side, I really did not do that well. And because this was actually where I needed to start picking up, by the time I started knitting and knit kind of here, I was like, uh-oh, like I clearly did not pick up enough at the end. That being said, it was okay because actually this buttonhole piece comes over the button piece. So even though this one is too short, I made sure that this one would be straight, so it would just hide this imperfection. So it's not a huge deal, but I would say be careful, because when you're picking up, it's kind of a little bit hard to tell if it's straight or not, and you really can't tell until you start knitting, and then you're like, oh crap, and then either you have to frog it and restart, or like me, just pray and go with it. And again, this was really a test knit for me to practice these techniques, so I wasn't too concerned that it wasn't going to be 100% perfect. But yeah, I think the button plackets came out really well. I think they look really, really cool. It was a fun construction for me to do. Especially doing the buttonholes, because I had never done buttonholes before, and I actually really enjoyed the process. I thought it was very therapeutic because the repeating pattern is just long enough so that it's interesting and you're learning new techniques, but also just short enough so that you don't have to look at the pattern for like, you know, a long time and have to keep referencing back to the pattern. And it's a pretty easy kind of pattern to remember. So once you get the hang of it, I was able to really fly through these button plackets, and I thought it was a really fun thing to learn. So yeah, it just kind of creates this extra panel that helps close the vest that way. And lastly, the only other technique I really learned was honestly just how to properly sew on these buttons. And Petite Knit has a great video showing you exactly how to sew on the buttons, and you really want to create this raised button look because the button plackets are so thick that when you button it, you want to create a gap so that let's see, so like that this side really sits nicely in between the button and the one below. So I hope that makes sense, because if you made the button really close to the bottom, then it would just be really squished and the button probably would pop out. But because it's raised like that, it really sits perfectly on top. And that is such a small detail, but I'm really glad that she incorporates that into the instructions and the video that accompanies this pattern, because, you know, as someone who's never done this before, I might not have thought of that and just sewn on the buttons and then been like, oh crap, like they totally don't stay. So I thought that was like really fun and a fun thing to learn. Like I mentioned, this did not really grow much after blocking. I think even with acrylic knits, it is worth blocking because the stitches do smooth out a bit and they kind of settle a bit, you know, in my mind. But I don't think this grew a lot, maybe like 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters. It grew, but that's okay because again, it creates this cropped little tank top look that I think is really cute. All right, now let's talk about the yarn that I used and the buttons that I used. The yarn that I used is the Lion brand Heartland yarn in the colorway Black Canyon. This is a yarn that I just had on hand. This is a medium weight yarn and the gauge is 16 stitches on size 9 needles, which I think size 9 is like 5.5 millimeters, 5 millimeters. Someone correct me. I always go by the millimeter size, never the actual size. So you can imagine that, just for reference, the gauge that is for the Lulu Slipover is, let's see, I have the pattern next to me. So the gauge for this, I believe, is 20. Yeah, 20 stitches on 4 millimeter needles. So I really had to do some math, and to be frank, I did not want to gauge swatch, and I did not gauge swatch, and that probably also impacted the way this came out, but that's just, again, how I go about it. It's a little chaotic. It's fine. It was for myself. I don't also plan to gauge swatch for my nieces, but that's because I'm using another Sandiscarn yarn that's very similar to the Peer Gynt, and it has the same gauge, so I don't feel the need to gauge swatch for that yarn as well, but I probably should have for this one. And I did a little bit, like I did a tiny little swatch on I used a 3.5 millimeter to really try to match gauge, and technically I did achieve it, but you can see it creates this ultra dense fabric that I actually don't hate, but you can see it's really, really, really dense. Like I'm stretching it out and you can't even really like see through it. It's so dense. I actually, again, I like the way this fabric turned out because it's nice and heavy and dense and it really looks like a sweater vest. But when you supposedly knit this with like a 5.5 millimeter needle, which is what it calls for, it's 16 stitches and it has a much looser, flowier fabric. So I kind of knew that going in, you know, that it was going to be a little dense like this. However, I will say it was pretty hard to knit in because I used 3.5 millimeters for the body, and then for the ribbing I used 3mm needles, which again, I don't think it created much of a difference. Again, because it's just so dense, there's not much of a difference between using a 3 or a 3.5 at that point, because it's as tight as you can kind of get it. I hope that makes sense. But anyways, so the ribbing is fine. And then the button plackets, I also use the smaller needle, but I don't know, it created like even a thicker button placket than probably it'll look like with the other yarn that I'm going to use. All that being said, like, it was fine. This yarn is a little splitty. And again, I think it was ultra splitty because when you're using such a small needle with a bigger yarn, I just feel like it splits easier than if I were to use a 5mm or 5.5mm. So I can't tell if that was really because I was using a much smaller needle size or if this yarn is just splitty. I mean, I do think this yarn is just a little easier to split apart, but it was fine. Like, ultimately, I did like knitting and purling with this yarn. It didn't really give me any hand cramps or anything. The splitting was really just the main thing that I noticed. Now, Petite Knit also sells all of the accessories that you might need for any of her patterns. Like, she sells buttons and zippers, and I don't know what else she sells, to my knowledge. I think maybe like elastic as well if you want to sew it into the neckline, but I did not want to go ahead and buy those buttons. She gives you the exact measurements of the buttons that she suggests you use, and so I just went by that size and went to Hobby Lobby and picked up some buttons. So these are the ones that I picked up. They are by Sewology, and they just look kind of like almost like mock wood, I suppose, but I think they're, you know, like 100% resin or plastic. But yeah, so those are the ones that I decided to go for with these, which I like. They like create like a nice little pop of color on the sides. I'm not sure if these will be the same buttons that I use for my nieces. I might actually let them pick out some fun buttons, you know, ones that are like a ladybug or something fun if they wanted to do that. TBD on the buttons, but that'll be the last thing that I do for their vests anyways, and we have some time, but those are the ones that I chose for this piece. Usually at the end of a pattern, and when I talk about it here on this podcast, I talk about whether or not I would knit it again. This is kind of an obvious, like, I'm gonna have to knit it again twice because these are the gifts that I'm going to knit for my nieces, but I'm pretty excited to knit it for them. It'll be a smaller vest size for both of them, so I think it'll work up really quickly, and I also think the yarn that I purchased for them will be fun to knit with, and they're also fun colors. I got like a bright pink for one of my nieces and a nice bright blue for my other niece, so I think it'll be a lot easier to see everything than on this black yarn. But I am really happy that I decided to knit this one just to, again, practice all those techniques that I haven't done before. Moving on to my second finished object, it is this Sophie scarf in the size large. It is knitted in the same yarn that I knit for my Tombow tee. It's the Hobbii Twister Solid in the color dark chocolate. I just had a lot of extra yarn left over from that one project, and yeah, I really like this. This is actually my first ever Sophie scarf, even though I think a lot of knitters really start with the Sophie scarf, but I don't know, I guess I kind of went into the deep end with starting with like a sweater. But yeah, I mean, it's popular for a reason. It's a small enough project that you can bring with you on the go anywhere, and I usually always have one Sophie scarf as a whip on the needles because that's a good, again, train knit or work knit. I pretty much knit this all at work, like during lunch hours or during staff meetings and things like that. And I think it looks really cute. This is actually going to be a gift for one of my friends, so I'm not going to be able to post this on Instagram until I give it to her for Christmas, but that's okay. I really like this color. I think she'll really like this color. And I'll put a photo of like how I styled it with this shirt. I do want to double check the like how big the large size is actually meant to be because I have not washed or blocked this, but to me it's a little tight because when I tie it like this, there's like not a lot of, I mean, I guess this is kind of how much she has in her photos, but I almost feel like I want it just to be a little longer, but if I tighten it anymore, it's like really tight. So okay, it's gonna bother me. So I'm not quite sure if maybe it's because of the yarn that I use that it's actually meant to be longer and maybe I just need to wash and block it, but I think it's still really cute and I think she'll like it. And I do have another one on the needles that I talked about in my first podcast, I think, that I haven't really worked on because I haven't really traveled anywhere, but that one is in 100% wool. So I'm interested to see the difference between, these two once that one is done. Now let's get into my whips. I have 2 whips. I'm not going to count the Sophie scarf that I always have because I'm not even going to bother mention those because those are just kind of like small little projects. But my 2 main whips that I have, one is the step-by-step sweater by Florence, which I showed in my last video, but I just want to show you some progress. I'm now, well into the body, probably getting close to starting on the ribbing. Maybe I have a few more centimeters left. This one, the pattern calls for 7 centimeters of ribbing, which to me, I think is a little long. I kind of like a shorter ribbed edge. So I'm actually going to probably knit a little longer than the pattern calls for and start the ribbing a little later. And the ribbing also usually calls to use like a smaller needle, but I might actually just stick with the needles I have, which I think are 5.5 millimeter needles, because I also don't like it when a sweater really cinches with the ribbing. I kind of like just a straight look. So TBD on that. I'll obviously talk about it once I actually finish it, what I ended up doing. But yeah, I know I originally said I was going to save this for Switzerland because I wanted an easy project to just knit in the round with while traveling there. But I don't know, I ended up just bringing this to work one day and really working on it a lot that day. So this was kind of like my work project for a bit. And I don't know, I might honestly just pick up yarn when we're there because I am going to 3 or 4 yarn stores in Zurich, which is our first stop. So I anticipate that I'm going to want to purchase some yarn there, and that way I'll just bring the needles that I'll need for a sweater and buy the yarn that I need in that quantity, and that way I don't have to like bring anything over. But then I kind of want to knit on the plane because it's like a, 8-hour plane ride, I think. So I don't know. I usually just sleep on planes, so it's not like the biggest deal if I don't have something to knit on the plane. But yeah, we'll see. I might end up pausing on this again and using it as just my plane project. The second whip that I have is completely new. I didn't even have this cast on when I did my last podcast, but it is another cloud blouse. I feel like I'm a very simple gal. Like when I find a pattern that I like that creates a silhouette that I like, I just want to knit that again. I don't have a super strong desire to find a ton of new patterns. And I don't know, I like the cloud blouse that I knit in my first podcast. If you want to see what that looks like, or follow me on Instagram, it's like on one of my posts. But the yarn that I used for that one was like a bamboo yarn. It was a little thicker, closer to like a true DK weight yarn. And I do like the finished piece. It's like a beach cover up. That's kind of what I knitted it for, to use like at the pool or just to throw over on the beach when it was cold. So there are definitely some mistakes, not mistakes, just little knitting inconsistencies that the yarn, because it was white yarn, really shows. But it doesn't bother me as much because again, I'm really wearing it to the beach and to the pool as like a casual top. But I wanted to knit a cloud top that was going to be a little more, put together, one that I could wear, out to dinner or to work even. So I picked up this yarn by Yarn Bee, which I'll show you in a second. And yeah, it creates this like beautiful lightweight fabric. It feels honestly a lot like wool, like the way it's knitting up, but this is 100% acrylic, or it's 60% acrylic and 40% polyamide. I'm not sure what the polyamide is. But yeah, I like this marbled look because it gives you that cool abstract stripy look where it almost looks like you did color work, but you are not, which again, I really like. I love a lazy knit where I can just use one ball of yarn. And yeah, I'm basically in the round now for about a few centimeters or a couple inches now. And all I have left is to go all the way down and then the sleeves. I feel like once you're here, once you join in the round in the cloud blouse, it kind of goes by really quickly. And I just have been enjoying this. I will say very quickly, I just wanted to note like the German short rows, I'm not sure if it's because of this yarn, because of how lightweight it is, but it does look a little, I don't know, maybe it's not, it doesn't look as bad on camera as it does in person, but I do think it looks just slightly messy. And let me know down below if you have this problem with German short rows. Maybe it's just because I'm using bigger needles, like I'm using a 5.5 to meet gauge, whereas this yarn usually calls for I think a 4mm needle, and it's like a 23 stitch gauge, but in order to meet the 20 gauge, I went up quite a bit. So maybe that's why it's creating this, because it just has more gaps in the knitting in general, so it's more pronounced with the German short rows. But I don't know, let me know down below if you've had this issue with German short rows, and maybe it's something I'm doing in my technique that needs to be tweaked, but it's okay. It doesn't bother me too much, but it is something that I notice just because, you know, I'm looking at it all the time. But I've been really enjoying this. Again, I've knitted this pattern before. This is probably not going to be the last time I knit it, and I like this yarn. So quickly about the yarn, this is the Yarn Bee. It's the Baby Bee line, so it's kind of like their baby blanket line, and this is in the color Jumping Juniper, and the gauge is 23 stitches with 4mm needles, and it's 60% acrylic, 40% polyamide. It's cheap. It's like $6 for this whole skein, and it comes with a lot of length. Like this has 115 grams and it's 377 yards, so it's quite long. And I just like this colorway. I like the blue and green and kind of orangey brown color. So I'm excited to see what this will look like. And I do like this yarn. It's easy to knit with. It's nice and soft. So if, you know, this blouse comes out really cute, I'll probably just do it in another colorway. They have this in a bunch of solid colors and a few other of this marbled color as well. Alrighty, lastly, let's talk about some future plans. I already mentioned the 2 Lulu slipovers that I need to knit for my nieces, so that will definitely happen at some point, probably closer to Christmas, because I don't anticipate them taking me too long to knit. And I actually think I knit faster and more concentrated when I have a deadline. So I think that'll just help me push me to like really finish those. So I probably won't start those until like end of October or November. In the meantime, while I have pretty much given up on summer knits, I did find one that I was kind of interested in, and it is a tank top. So I think it's more accessible for me than even a t-shirt, because I don't have to do sleeves at all. You kind of just have to do, you know, the front, the back panel, and knit in the round. And it is the Vegas top by Susanna Mueller. I think she knits it with the Lamina Cosma yarn, which my local yarn shop does carry Lamina, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it. So maybe I will do it in that, you know, suggested yarn, but I'm also thinking about trying the Sandnesgarn yarn Line, and I think that will meet gauge. This is a 19 stitch gauge, so it's a DK weight top, which is pretty much my limit. Like anything smaller than 20 stitches, like anything tighter than that, I get really intimidated by. Like sometimes I know a lot of summer knits are kind of at the 28 stitch gauge weight, and that to me I just have no joy in knitting something like that. So I do think because this is like a DK weight tank top, it'll be more up my lane. Like I said, I do want to try the Sandnesgarn Line line, so I think I might knit this top next. And the only other thing that I've been really looking at are 2 potential cardigans by Petite Knit. One is the Novice cardigan in the Chunky edition, which has a gauge of 14 stitches. So I feel like that's appealing because it's going to be nice and thick and chunky and quick to work up. And the other one is her Eva cardigan, and that has a 20 stitch gauge. So it's a DK weight cardigan, which I think creates like this beautiful light kind of fabric, and it looks really, really cute online. But again, that 20 stitch gauge just sometimes really intimidates me for a sweater. But yeah, let me know down below if you've knit either or even the Novice cardigan in the DK weight. I would love to know your thoughts on either one. I think they look very similar. The Eva cardigan maybe is a little more oversized, and the Eva cardigan also looks very similar to 2 cardigans that I have in my current collection that I wear all the time. So I don't know if I want a 3rd cardigan that's just gonna look very similar. But the Novice cardigan, because it's 14 stitches, it's gonna be easier to knit up. It'll just be less of a time commitment to knit something like that. So that's kind of my reasoning behind either or, but I have not made a decision yet. So again, let me know down below if you've knit any of those. So I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. Like I said, I'm really active on Instagram, so if you'd like to follow me or interact with me there, see what I'm up to, follow me down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.